In the grand ballroom of Valdoria Palace, where crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors, a single piece of parchment would shatter a kingdom's foundation. Queen Isabella had ruled for 30 years with grace and wisdom, but tonight, as she held the damning letter in trembling hands, she realized that even crowns could not protect against the cruelest betrayals. The document revealed a conspiracy so deep, so personal, that it would force her to choose between her heart and her throne. What she discovered about her most trusted advisor would change the course of royal history forever. The autumn rain hammered against the tall windows of Valdoria Palace as Queen Isabella Montclair paced the length of her private study. At 52, she carried herself with the dignity befitting a monarch who had weathered 3 decades on the throne, yet tonight her usual composure was fractured. The ornate room, filled with leather-bound books and portraits of her ancestors, felt smaller than usual, as if the walls were closing in on secrets too heavy to bear. Lady Evangeline Hartwell, her closest confidant and chief advisor for the past 15 years, sat rigidly in the burgundy armchair across from the Queen's desk. Her silver hair was pulled back in its customary severe bun, and her pale blue eyes showed no emotion as she watched Isabella's agitated movements. To any observer, Evangeline appeared the picture of loyal service, but beneath her composed exterior lay calculations that would have horrified those who trusted her. The kingdom of Valdoria had prospered under Isabella's rule. Nestled between mountain ranges and bordered by the Cerulean Sea, it was a realm known for its progressive policies and peaceful relations with neighboring countries. The capital city of Astoria bustled with merchants and scholars, while the countryside flourished with prosperous farms and thriving villages. Yet this prosperity had not come without challenges, and Isabella had relied heavily on Evangeline's counsel to navigate the complex web of royal politics. Prince Alexander, Isabella's eldest son and heir to the throne, had been causing concern for months. At 28, he possessed the charm and intelligence necessary for kingship, but his recent behavior had become increasingly erratic. He questioned every royal decision, challenged long-standing traditions, and, worst of all, had begun forming alliances with nobles who had historically opposed the crown. Isabella suspected outside influence, but she could never have imagined how close to home the manipulation truly was. The evening had begun like any other, with Isabella reviewing state papers while Evangeline provided updates on various matters of governance. Trade negotiations with the neighboring kingdom of Meridia were proceeding smoothly. The harvest reports showed promising yields, and preparations for the upcoming autumn festival were well underway. It was during this routine discussion that a young page had burst into the study, his face flushed with urgency. The boy, barely 16 and normally composed despite his youth, had stumbled over his words as he presented a sealed letter. He explained that a hooded figure had approached the palace gates, thrust the message into his hands, and disappeared into the night before the guards could react. The envelope bore no royal seal or identifying marks, only Isabella's name written in an unfamiliar hand. As Isabella broke the plain wax seal and unfolded the parchment, her face had gone pale. The letter was brief but devastating in its implications. It spoke of betrayal within the palace walls, of trusted advisors who served foreign masters, and of a conspiracy to undermine the very foundation of Valdoria's monarchy. Most shocking of all, it contained specific details about private conversations and decisions that only someone with intimate access to the royal family could have known. Evangeline had watched this unfold with carefully maintained concern, offering comfort and suggesting the letter might be the work of malicious gossips or foreign agents seeking to sow discord. Her voice remained steady as she advised caution, recommending that they investigate the claims thoroughly before taking any action. To Isabella, still reeling from the accusations, Evangeline's measured response seemed like the voice of reason in a moment of chaos. However, the letter had contained one detail that made Isabella's blood run cold. It mentioned a specific conversation she had shared with Evangeline just the previous week about Prince Alexander's behavior. During that private discussion, Isabella had confided her deepest fears about her son's future and the kingdom's stability. The letter's author knew not only what had been said, but also Evangeline's exact words of response. This level of knowledge could only come from someone who had been present during that intimate conversation. The implications were staggering. If the letter spoke truth, then Evangeline, the woman Isabella had trusted above all others, was not the loyal advisor she appeared to be. The very person who had helped shape Valdoria's policies and guided its future was potentially working against everything Isabella held dear. The thought was so unthinkable that Isabella's mind initially rejected it, but the evidence was too specific to dismiss. As the hours passed, Isabella found herself studying Evangeline with new eyes. She noticed things she had previously overlooked. The way Evangeline's gaze sometimes drifted when she thought herself unobserved, the subtle questions she asked about matters that seemed unrelated to her duties, and the frequency with which she corresponded with contacts outside the kingdom. What had once seemed like thorough dedication now appeared potentially sinister. The queen's thoughts turned to her children and the future of Valdoria. Prince Alexander's recent behavior suddenly made more sense if viewed through the lens of manipulation. Princess Catherine, her younger daughter, had also grown distant lately, spending more time with courtiers whom Evangeline had recommended. Even Prince Marcus, her youngest at 23, had begun questioning traditions that Evangeline had subtly criticized in their presence. The weight of potential betrayal pressed down on Isabella like a physical force. For 15 years, she had shared her deepest concerns, her strategic thoughts, and her plans for the kingdom with someone who might have been reporting every word to unknown enemies. The ramifications extended far beyond personal hurt. State secrets, military strategies, and diplomatic negotiations could all have been compromised. As midnight approached, Isabella made a decision that would change everything. She could not confront Evangeline directly without more evidence, but she also could not continue as if nothing had happened. The anonymous letter had provided a starting point, but she needed proof of the allegations before taking action against someone who had been integral to her reign. The storm outside seemed to mirror the turmoil within the palace walls. Thunder rolled across the kingdom as Isabella began to plan her next moves. She would need to be clever and cautious, investigating the claims while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. One wrong step could expose her suspicions and potentially destroy any chance of uncovering the truth. Evangeline finally rose from her chair, citing the late hour and suggesting they continue their discussion the following day. As she moved toward the door, Isabella watched her carefully, searching for any sign of deception in her movements or expression. The woman who had been her closest ally now seemed like a stranger, and Isabella realized that nothing in her life would ever feel secure again. The queen nodded her agreement to postpone their conversation, but both women knew that something fundamental had shifted in the room that night. As Evangeline's footsteps faded down the corridor, Isabella remained alone with her thoughts and the damning letter that had shattered her world. The investigation that would follow would test not only her skills as a monarch, but also her ability to survive the ultimate betrayal by someone she had considered family. In the silence that followed, broken only by the continuing storm outside, Isabella began to understand that the greatest threats to her kingdom had not come from foreign armies or political rivals, but from the person who had sat beside her throne for 15 years, quietly dismantling everything she had built from within. The realization filled her with a cold determination that would drive her actions in the dangerous days ahead. Dawn broke gray and unwelcoming over Valdoria Palace as Queen Isabella stood at her bedroom window, having barely slept since receiving the devastating letter. The storm had passed, leaving the gardens below glistening with moisture that reflected the pale morning light. But the tempest in Isabella's mind raged stronger than ever as she contemplated the web of deception that might have ensnared her kingdom. She had spent the sleepless hours developing a plan that would either prove Evangeline's innocence or confirm her worst fears. The queen understood that she could trust no one completely until she had answers, which meant conducting her investigation with the utmost secrecy. One careless word or suspicious action could alert Evangeline to her discovery and potentially trigger whatever endgame the conspiracy might have planned. Isabella's first step was to recall Sir Edmund Blackwood, the former head of the Royal Intelligence Network who had retired to his countryside estate 3 years earlier. Edmund had served her father before her and possessed an institutional memory that stretched back decades. More importantly, he had recruited and trained the network of agents who monitored both internal and external threats to the kingdom. If anyone could help her navigate this treacherous situation, it was the man who had spent his life protecting the crown from shadows. The queen composed a carefully worded letter to Edmund, disguising her urgent summons as an invitation to discuss historical matters for a book she claimed to be writing about her father's reign. The coded language would be clear to the old spymaster while appearing innocent to anyone who might intercept the message. She sealed the letter herself and entrusted it to Thomas, a young stable hand whose family had served the crown for generations and whose loyalty was beyond question. Meanwhile, Evangeline went about her morning duties with apparent normalcy, attending the daily briefing with palace staff and reviewing the schedule of appointments for the coming week. To Isabella's trained eye, however, there were subtle differences in her advisor's behavior. Evangeline's questions seemed more pointed, her interest in certain matters more intense than warranted. When discussing the upcoming visit from the ambassador of Meridia, Evangeline's inquiries about security arrangements struck Isabella as oddly specific. The morning's royal audience provided Isabella with an opportunity to observe Evangeline's interactions with various courtiers and nobles. As she listened to petitions and resolved disputes, the queen watched her advisor's face for reactions to different speakers and topics. She noticed that Evangeline paid particular attention to Lord Harrison Blackthorne, a nobleman whose estates bordered Meridia and whose loyalty to the crown had occasionally been questioned in the past. Lord Blackthorne presented a petition regarding trade routes through his territory, but Isabella detected an undercurrent of communication between him and Evangeline that went beyond the formal proceedings. Their eye contact was brief but meaningful, and Evangeline's slight nod in response to something Blackthorne said was so subtle that it would have been missed by anyone not specifically watching for such signs. The audience concluded without incident, but Isabella retained Lord Blackthorne's petition for further review, citing the need to consult with various ministers about its implications. This would give her an excuse to investigate the nobleman more thoroughly while maintaining the pretense of normal governmental procedures. That afternoon, Isabella met privately with Captain Marcus Sterling, the head of her personal guard. Sterling was a man of unquestionable integrity who had proven his loyalty through years of faithful service. Without revealing the full scope of her suspicions, she asked him to discreetly increase security around certain sensitive areas of the palace and to monitor the movements of key personnel. She framed these requests as precautionary measures related to the upcoming diplomatic visit, but Sterling's sharp eyes told her he understood there was more to the situation than she was revealing. As evening approached, Isabella received word that Edmund Blackwood had agreed to her invitation and would arrive at the palace within 2 days. The old spymaster's quick response to her coded message confirmed that he recognized the urgency beneath her formal words. She felt a small measure of relief knowing that soon she would have an ally with the skills and experience necessary to uncover the truth. The day's investigation had already yielded disturbing patterns. Evangeline's behavior, Lord Blackthorne's subtle communications, and the timing of various recent events began to form a picture that filled Isabella with growing dread. She recalled several instances over the past months when Evangeline had encouraged policies or decisions that seemed beneficial at the time, but had ultimately weakened Valdoria's position in subtle ways. The trade agreement with a merchant consortium that Evangeline had enthusiastically supported had resulted in increased dependence on foreign suppliers for critical goods. The military reforms she had recommended had shifted resources away from border defenses toward ceremonial units. Even the marriage proposals for Prince Alexander that she had presented came from families with questionable loyalties or foreign connections. Each individual decision had seemed reasonable when viewed in isolation, but together they formed a pattern of gradual weakening that could only be the result of deliberate planning. Isabella realized that if her suspicions were correct, Evangeline had been systematically undermining Valdoria's independence and security while maintaining the facade of loyal service. That evening, during dinner in the palace's grand dining hall, Isabella watched as Evangeline interacted with her children. The advisor spoke with Prince Alexander about his recent meetings with various nobles, subtly encouraging his rebellious attitudes while appearing to offer wise counsel. With Princess Catherine, she discussed social events and potential suitors, steering the conversation toward individuals with foreign ties. Even with young Prince Marcus, she planted seeds of doubt about traditional royal protocols and the burden of duty. The manipulation was so skillful that Isabella marveled at how she had failed to recognize it earlier. Evangeline presented herself as a progressive thinker, encouraging the royal children to question outdated traditions, but her true goal appeared to be the erosion of their connection to Valdoria's heritage and their commitment to the crown's responsibilities. As the meal progressed, Isabella felt increasingly isolated by her knowledge. She wanted to warn her children about the influence being exerted upon them, but any premature action could jeopardize her investigation and potentially place them in greater danger. The weight of maintaining normalcy while suspecting the worst about someone so close to her family was almost unbearable. After dinner, Evangeline requested a private meeting to discuss preparations for the Meridian ambassador's visit. As they sat in Isabella's study, the very room where the anonymous letter had been received, the Queen struggled to maintain her composure while listening to recommendations that now seemed designed to compromise palace security rather than enhance diplomatic relations. Evangeline suggested reducing the usual ceremonial guard presence to create a more intimate atmosphere for negotiations. She recommended housing the ambassador's larger entourage in quarters that would give them access to sensitive areas of the palace. Most troubling of all, she proposed arranging private meetings between the ambassador and several nobles, including Lord Blackthorne, ostensibly to showcase Valdoria's openness to diplomatic engagement. Each suggestion was presented with logical reasoning and apparent concern for the kingdom's interests, but Isabella now heard them as potential elements of a larger conspiracy. The reduced security, increased access, and private meetings could facilitate communications or actions that would be impossible under normal diplomatic protocols. As the meeting concluded and Evangeline departed for her chambers, Isabella remained in her study, contemplating the magnitude of the threat her kingdom faced. If her suspicions proved correct, the upcoming diplomatic visit might serve as a cover for activities that could fundamentally alter Valdoria's future. The anonymous letter had warned of betrayal, but the full scope of that betrayal was only beginning to reveal itself. The Queen spent another sleepless night planning her next moves while counting the hours until Edmund Blackwood's arrival. She understood that time was running short, and that the mysterious forces working against her kingdom were likely moving towards some sort of climax. The challenge was to uncover their plans and neutralize the threat before irreparable damage could be done to everything she had spent her life protecting. Sir Edmund Blackwood arrived at Valdoria Palace under cover of darkness 2 nights later, his carriage entering through a service gate normally used by merchants and craftsmen. At 71, the former spymaster still moved with the quiet efficiency that had made him legendary in intelligence circles. His weathered face bore the marks of decades spent in the shadows, and his pale gray eyes missed nothing as he was escorted through the palace's lesser corridors to avoid detection. Isabella met him in the palace's ancient library, a vast chamber filled with centuries of accumulated knowledge where their conversation would be masked by the thick stone walls and countless books that absorbed sound. The choice of location was deliberate. If anyone questioned their meeting, it would support her cover story about researching historical matters for her supposed book project. Edmund listened without interruption as Isabella revealed the contents of the anonymous letter and shared her growing suspicions about Evangeline's activities. His expression remained neutral throughout her account, but she caught the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated his sharp mind was already analyzing the information and forming conclusions. When she finished speaking, Edmund was quiet for several moments before responding. His voice, still strong despite his age, carried the weight of experience as he confirmed her worst fears. He had suspected for years that Valdoria faced internal threats, but the specific details Isabella provided painted a picture more dire than even he had imagined. The old spymaster revealed that his agents had reported strange patterns in the months before his retirement. Communications between certain nobles and foreign contacts had increased, while loyalist families found themselves gradually excluded from important court functions and decision-making processes. At the time, these changes had seemed like natural shifts in the political landscape, but viewed through the lens of organized conspiracy, they took on sinister significance. Edmund explained that Lady Evangeline Hartwell's background contained several troubling elements that had been overlooked during her initial appointment to the royal court. Her family had suffered significant financial losses during a trade dispute with Meridia 15 years earlier, losses that had mysteriously been recovered through investments that should not have been profitable. Her rapid rise to prominence in court had been facilitated by recommendations from nobles whose own loyalties were questionable. Most damning of all, Edmund's network had identified subtle patterns in Valdoria's policy decisions that had consistently benefited Meridia's interests while weakening Valdoria's strategic position. Trade agreements had favored Meridian merchants, military positioning had left key border areas vulnerable, and diplomatic initiatives had isolated Valdoria from potential allies while strengthening ties with countries that served Meridian interests. The former spymaster's analysis painted Evangeline not as an opportunistic traitor but as a long-term agent who had been carefully positioned to influence Valdoria's future. Her 15 years of loyal service had been an extended operation designed to gain maximum access to royal secrets and decision-making processes. The betrayal was not recent, but had been ongoing since almost the beginning of her tenure. Edmund's most shocking revelation concerned Prince Alexander's recent behavioral changes. The old spy had maintained contacts within the court even after retirement, and these sources reported that the prince had been meeting secretly with individuals who were not part of the official court structure. These meetings had been arranged by intermediaries connected to Evangeline, and they appeared to be part of an effort to turn the heir against his mother's policies and advisors. The conspiracy's goal was becoming clear: to create a crisis of confidence in Isabella's leadership, while positioning Prince Alexander as a more malleable alternative who would pursue policies favorable to foreign interests. Evangeline's influence over the prince would ensure that even if Isabella were removed from power through abdication or other means, Valdoria's future would remain under external control. Isabella felt a chill as she realized how close the conspiracy had come to success. Her son's rebellious behavior had indeed caused her to question her own judgment and consider stepping aside to preserve the kingdom's stability. The manipulators had been counting on her maternal instincts and devotion to Valdoria to lead her to sacrifice herself for what appeared to be the greater good. Edmund outlined a plan to counter the conspiracy that would require careful timing and absolute secrecy. They would need to gather evidence of the treacherous activities while maintaining the appearance of normal court life. This meant allowing the upcoming diplomatic visit to proceed, while using it as an opportunity to expose the true nature of the plot against Valdoria. The former spymaster had already begun reaching out to his most trusted former agents, men and women who had served Valdoria faithfully for decades and whose loyalty was beyond question. These individuals would form a shadow network within the palace and capital city, monitoring communications and activities while reporting directly to Edmund rather than through official channels that might be compromised. Isabella agreed to Edmund's plan, but insisted on taking personal risks that the old spy considered unwise. She wanted to continue her normal interactions with Evangeline, while carefully documenting evidence of her advisor's treachery. This would mean maintaining the pretense of trust and friendship, while knowing that every conversation was potentially feeding information to enemies of the kingdom. The queen also decided to test Evangeline's loyalties by providing her with carefully crafted false information to see how it was used. If the fabricated intelligence found its way to foreign agents or appeared in actions taken against Valdoria's interests, it would provide concrete proof of the conspiracy while potentially disrupting whatever plans were already in motion. Over the following days, Isabella began implementing her part of Edmund's plan while struggling with the emotional toll of suspecting someone she had considered family. During their daily meetings, she found herself studying Evangeline's every word and gesture for signs of deception while maintaining the warm relationship they had shared for 15 years. The false information Isabella provided concerned fictional plans to strengthen border defenses near Meridia, complete with specific troop movements and fortification schedules. She presented this information during a private conversation about security preparations, framing it as highly confidential intelligence that could not be shared with anyone outside their inner circle. Evangeline's response was perfect in its apparent loyalty and concern. She asked thoughtful questions about the logistics involved and offered suggestions for maintaining secrecy around the operation. Her performance was so convincing that Isabella almost doubted her own suspicions, but Edmund had warned her that skilled agents were masters of deception who could maintain their cover even under intense scrutiny. Meanwhile, Prince Alexander's behavior continued to deteriorate as he grew increasingly critical of his mother's leadership and more receptive to alternative viewpoints provided by his mysterious new advisors. Princess Catherine began expressing interest in suitors from families with questionable loyalties, while Prince Marcus started questioning the value of traditional royal ceremonies and protocols. The manipulation of her children was perhaps the most painful aspect of the conspiracy for Isabella to witness. She wanted to protect them from the influences that were shaping their thoughts and attitudes, but any direct intervention might alert Evangeline to her suspicions and compromise the investigation. Instead, she had to watch as her family was gradually turned against the values and traditions that had defined their dynasty for centuries. As the date for the Meridian ambassador's arrival approached, tensions within the palace reached a breaking point. Isabella's careful observation of court activities revealed a network of communication and coordination that went far beyond normal diplomatic preparations. Certain nobles were making unusual travel arrangements, palace staff were being repositioned in ways that served no apparent purpose, and security protocols were being modified based on Evangeline's recommendations. Edmund's agents reported increased activity among Meridian contacts within Valdoria, with coded messages passing between the capital and border regions where Lord Blackthorn's estates provided convenient crossing points. The pattern suggested that the diplomatic visit would serve as a signal for coordinated actions that could destabilize the kingdom at its most vulnerable moment. The evidence was mounting, but Isabella knew that accusations without absolute proof could destroy innocent lives and potentially trigger the very crisis the conspiracy sought to create. She needed to catch the traitors in an act so blatant that their guilt would be undeniable to all observers, including her own children who had been influenced by Evangeline's subtle manipulations. As she prepared for what would likely be the most dangerous week of her reign, Isabella reflected on the price of crown and the terrible isolation that came with discovering that those closest to the throne were sometimes its greatest enemies. The upcoming diplomatic visit would determine not only Valdoria's future, but also whether a queen's love for her kingdom could overcome the most intimate betrayal imaginable. The morning of the Meridian ambassador's arrival dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight streaming through the palace windows, as if nature itself sought to illuminate the shadows that had gathered within Valdoria's walls. Queen Isabella stood in her private chambers, adjusting the ceremonial crown that had been worn by her ancestors during countless diplomatic ceremonies. Today, however, the weight of the golden circlet seemed heavier than ever, pressing down with the burden of knowledge that could destroy everything she held dear. Ambassador Lucien Voss arrived with a retinue larger than typically warranted for a routine diplomatic visit. His entourage included not only the usual complement of secretaries and protocol officers, but also several individuals whose roles were unclear and whose backgrounds Edmund's agents were still investigating. Isabella observed from the throne room's elevated platform as the formal presentations were made, noting how Evangeline's attention focused on specific members of the ambassador's party. The welcoming ceremony proceeded according to ancient tradition, with elaborate speeches about friendship between kingdoms and mutual prosperity. Ambassador Voss was a man in his 50s with silver hair and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of the palace's layout and security arrangements. When he spoke, his words carried the polished diplomatic language that revealed nothing while promising everything. During the formal banquet that evening, Isabella watched carefully as Evangeline orchestrated seating arrangements that placed key Valdorian nobles near specific members of the Meridian delegation. Lord Blackthorn found himself beside a Meridian trade representative who had arrived without apparent commercial credentials, while other questionable courtiers were positioned to engage with delegates whose true functions remained mysterious. The conversation flowed smoothly across topics of trade, cultural exchange, and regional stability, but Isabella detected undercurrents of meaning in seemingly innocent remarks. When Ambassador Voss mentioned the challenges of governing in changing times, his eyes fixed on Prince Alexander with an intensity that suggested foreknowledge of the prince's recent rebellious attitudes. Similarly, his comments about the burden of leadership appeared directed specifically at Isabella, as if testing her resolve or probing for weakness. Prince Alexander responded to the ambassador's subtle encouragement with criticisms of traditional policies that seemed remarkably similar to points Evangeline had been making in private conversations. The prince's words were his own, but the ideas behind them bore the unmistakable stamp of careful manipulation. Isabella realized with growing horror that her son was unknowingly serving as a mouthpiece for foreign interests that sought to undermine his own inheritance. As the evening progressed, Isabella excused herself from the gathering under the pretense of attending to urgent state business. In reality, she met with Edmund in a secure chamber beneath the palace where they monitored the activities of their suspects through a network of loyal servants and guards who had been positioned throughout the building. The intelligence they gathered confirmed their worst fears. Evangeline had arranged a series of private meetings between Meridian delegates and Valdorian nobles that were taking place in various locations throughout the palace. These conversations were occurring in chambers that had been carefully selected to avoid normal security surveillance, and the participants were using routes through the palace that bypassed areas where their movements might be observed. Edmund's agents had managed to position themselves near several of these meetings, and the fragments of conversation they overheard revealed discussions about timing, coordination, and resources that had nothing to do with legitimate diplomatic business. References to the transition and new arrangements suggested that the conspiracy was moving toward its final phase. Most alarming of all was intelligence about Prince Alexander's activities. The prince had been approached during the banquet by a Meridian delegate who suggested a private discussion about opportunities for progressive leadership. Alexander had agreed to meet with this individual later that evening, apparently unaware that he was being recruited for purposes that would ultimately destroy everything he was meant to inherit. Isabella made the difficult decision to allow these meetings to proceed while documenting everything that occurred. The evidence they were gathering would be crucial for exposing the conspiracy, but every moment of delay risked further damage to her family and kingdom. She had to balance the need for absolute proof against the danger of allowing the plot to advance too far toward fruition. The false information she had provided to Evangeline about border fortifications had already begun to bear fruit in ways that confirmed the advisor's treachery. Edmund's agents reported unusual movement near the supposedly classified military positions, with individuals conducting surveillance that could only have been guided by the fabricated intelligence Isabella had shared. The coordination required for such rapid response proved that Evangeline was in active communication with foreign operatives. Late that night, as the palace settled into apparent quiet, Isabella and Edmund's network observed a level of activity that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy. Messages were being passed between various chambers. Coded signals were being exchanged through seemingly innocent gestures, and several Meridian delegates left their assigned quarters to meet with Valdorian accomplices in locations throughout the palace. The most damaging discovery came when they observed Evangeline herself leaving her chambers near midnight for a clandestine meeting with Ambassador Voss. The two met in the palace's ancient chapel, a location chosen for its symbolic significance and acoustic properties that would make eavesdropping difficult. However, Edmund's preparations had anticipated such a meeting, and hidden observers documented an exchange that finally provided the absolute proof Isabella needed. The conversation they witnessed revealed Evangeline reporting on Isabella's mental state and decision-making processes while receiving instructions for the conspiracy's next phase. Ambassador Voss expressed satisfaction with Prince Alexander's receptiveness to new ideas and outlined plans for accelerating his alienation from his mother's advisors. They discussed timing for a crisis that would create pressure for Isabella's abdication in favor of her more malleable son. Most shocking of all was their discussion of Princess Catherine's upcoming engagement to a Meridian nobleman, an arrangement that had been secretly negotiated without Isabella's knowledge and was designed to cement Valdoria's subordination to foreign interests. The marriage would be presented as a diplomatic triumph while actually serving as a mechanism for permanent influence over the royal family. Isabella listened to this betrayal with a mixture of rage and heartbreak that threatened to overwhelm her self-control. The woman she had trusted above all others was not only selling state secrets, but actively working to destroy her family's independence and legacy. The scope of Evangeline's deception was so complete that virtually every major decision of the past 15 years had been influenced by foreign manipulation. As dawn approached, and the palace began to stir with the activities of a new day, Isabella prepared to take action that would expose the conspiracy while minimizing damage to innocent parties who had been unknowingly manipulated. The evidence was overwhelming, but the challenge now was presenting it in a way that would convince those who had been influenced by years of subtle manipulation to question their own beliefs and loyalties. The Queen understood that the coming confrontation would test not only her political skills, but also her ability to maintain the moral authority necessary for effective leadership. She would need to expose Evangeline's treachery while demonstrating mercy toward those who had been deceived, including her own children who had been turned against their inheritance through no fault of their own. The diplomatic visit that was supposed to strengthen Valdoria's international relationships had instead become the stage for revealing the greatest threat the kingdom had ever faced. As Isabella prepared for the most crucial day of her reign, she drew strength from the knowledge that truth, however painful, was always preferable to the comfortable lies that had nearly destroyed everything her ancestors had built. The final confrontation with those who had betrayed her trust would require every ounce of wisdom and courage she possessed, but Isabella was determined that Valdoria's independence would not be sacrificed on the altar of foreign ambition and personal greed. The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as Queen Isabella prepared for the confrontation that would determine Valdoria's future. She had spent the pre-dawn hours in prayer and meditation, seeking the strength and wisdom necessary to handle the delicate task ahead. The evidence against Evangeline and her co-conspirators was overwhelming, but the manner of their exposure would be crucial for maintaining stability and preserving the monarchy's legitimacy. Isabella chose to act during the scheduled morning session of the Royal Council, where both domestic and foreign dignitaries would be present to witness whatever transpired. The public nature of the confrontation would prevent any attempt to suppress the evidence while ensuring that the truth reached all levels of Valdorian society. Ambassador Voss and his delegation had been invited to observe the council proceedings as part of their diplomatic visit, unknowingly walking into the trap that would expose their true purposes. Sir Edmund Blackwood had positioned his most trusted agents throughout the chamber, ready to prevent any attempt at escape or violence when the accusations were made public. Captain Sterling and his guards were prepared to arrest the conspirators while maintaining order among the shocked witnesses who would learn that their kingdom had been betrayed from within. As the council session began, Isabella maintained her customary dignity while conducting routine business. Trade reports were presented, judicial matters were discussed, and administrative decisions were made with the same careful deliberation that had characterized her reign. To all observers, it appeared to be another normal morning of governance. But those who knew her well detected an underlying tension that suggested something significant was about to occur. Evangeline sat in her usual place at Isabella's right hand, participating in discussions with the same apparent loyalty and competence she had displayed for 15 years. Her performance was flawless, showing no sign that she suspected her treachery had been discovered. The ambassador and his delegates observed from their designated area, taking notes and asking occasional questions about Valdorian governmental procedures. The moment of revelation came when Isabella called for a report on border security measures. She announced that recent intelligence had suggested potential threats to the kingdom's stability and that a thorough investigation had been conducted to identify the source of these concerns. The chamber fell silent as she began to present evidence that would shatter the illusions many had held about the loyalty of those closest to the crown. Isabella's presentation was methodical and devastating. She revealed the anonymous letter that had first alerted her to internal threats, then presented documentation of communications between Valdorian nobles and foreign agents. The false intelligence about border fortifications that she had shared with Evangeline was shown to have reached enemy hands within hours, proving that someone with intimate access to royal secrets was actively betraying the kingdom's interests. The reactions in the chamber ranged from shock to disbelief as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. Some nobles who had been unknowingly manipulated by the conspirators appeared genuinely horrified to learn how their actions had been influenced by foreign agents. Others, whose involvement was more direct, began to show signs of panic as they realized their treachery had been exposed. Ambassador Voss maintained his diplomatic composure even as evidence mounted of Meridia's involvement in the plot against Valdoria. His trained features revealed nothing, but his eyes showed the calculation of a professional operative whose mission had been compromised. He neither confirmed nor denied the accusations, maintaining the fiction of legitimate diplomatic business even as his cover story crumbled around him. The most painful moment for Isabella came when she confronted Evangeline directly with evidence of her betrayal. The advisor's mask finally slipped as she realized that her years of careful manipulation had been discovered and documented. Her pale eyes showed a mixture of defiance and resignation as she understood that her position was hopeless. Evangeline's response was neither denial nor apology, but a cold explanation of her motivations. She spoke of Valdoria's need for stronger leadership and more progressive policies, presenting her betrayal as patriotic service to a kingdom that required modernization. Her words were designed to justify her actions while appealing to those who had been influenced by her years of subtle manipulation. The advisor's speech revealed the depth of her delusion and the sophistication of her rationalization. She genuinely believed that foreign control would benefit Valdoria by forcing it to abandon outdated traditions and embrace more efficient methods of governance. Her betrayal had been motivated not by simple greed but by an ideological conviction that Isabella's rule was inadequate for the challenges facing the kingdom. Prince Alexander's reaction to these revelations was particularly painful for Isabella to witness. The young man's face showed the confusion and shame of someone who realized he had been manipulated into betraying his own family and inheritance. The rebellious attitudes he had developed under Evangeline's influence were revealed as foreign manipulation designed to turn him against everything he was meant to protect. Princess Catherine and Prince Marcus displayed similar shock as they understood how their thoughts and preferences had been shaped by someone who served external interests rather than their family's welfare. The damage to their trust and self-confidence would require years to heal, but their recognition of how they had been deceived was the first step toward recovery. The confrontation concluded with the arrest of Evangeline and several co-conspirators, including Lord Blackthorn and other nobles whose involvement had been proven through the investigation. Ambassador Voss and his delegation were given 24 hours to leave Valdoria, their diplomatic immunity protecting them from arrest, but not from the exposure of their true mission. As the immediate crisis passed and order was restored to the chamber, Isabella addressed the broader implications of what had been revealed. She acknowledged that the kingdom had been wounded by betrayal, but emphasized that the exposure of internal threats made Valdoria stronger rather than weaker. The conspiracy's failure demonstrated the resilience of institutions and traditions that had seemed outdated to those who sought to destroy them. The Queen's handling of the crisis enhanced rather than diminished her authority. Her patient investigation had protected innocent parties while ensuring that the guilty faced appropriate consequences. The contrast between her steady leadership and the chaos that foreign manipulation had sought to create validated the wisdom of traditional governance methods that conspirators had dismissed as obsolete. In the days that followed, Isabella worked to heal the divisions that manipulation had created within the royal family and court. Prince Alexander underwent a painful process of examining his recent attitudes and decisions, learning to distinguish between his genuine convictions and ideas that had been planted by foreign agents. His sisters faced similar challenges as they rebuilt their understanding of themselves and their duties. The kingdom's response to the exposed conspiracy was one of unity and renewed determination to protect Valdorian independence. Citizens who learned of the plot experienced anger at the betrayal, but also pride in their queen's wisdom and strength. The foreign attempt at manipulation had backfired by demonstrating the value of the traditions and institutions it had sought to destroy. Evangeline's trial became a public education in the methods of subversion and manipulation that foreign powers used against independent kingdoms. Her conviction and exile served not only as punishment for her crimes, but as a warning to others who might consider similar betrayals. The detailed evidence presented during the proceedings helped citizens understand how subtle influences could gradually erode national sovereignty. Queen Isabella emerged from the crisis with her authority strengthened and her people united behind her leadership. The painful discovery of betrayal within her inner circle had taught valuable lessons about trust and vigilance that would protect Valdoria for generations to come. The kingdom's survival of such an intimate threat demonstrated the enduring power of legitimate governance based on genuine service to the people rather than foreign interests. As autumn gave way to winter and life in Valdoria returned to normal patterns, Isabella reflected on the lessons learned from her greatest trial as a monarch. The experience had been painful beyond measure, but it had also revealed the strength and resilience that made her kingdom worth defending. The crown she wore was heavier for the knowledge of how it could be lost, but also more precious for the understanding of what it truly represented. The queen's victory over those who sought to destroy her realm from within became a defining moment of her reign, proving that wisdom and patience could triumph over deception and manipulation. Valdoria's independence had been preserved not through military might, but through the moral authority of leadership that served the kingdom's true interests rather than foreign ambitions or personal gain. In the end, the royal drama that had threatened to destroy everything Isabella held dear became instead a testament to the enduring power of truth and the ultimate futility of betraying the trust of those who serve something greater than themselves. The crown of Valdoria remained secure, carried by a queen who had learned that the greatest threats to any kingdom come not from external enemies but from those within who forget what loyalty and honor truly mean.